Anna, over
I,
to you.
I'll share my screen and then Lorna's going to do the first half of the presentation and I'm going to do the second half. So I'll hand over to Lorna for now. Is that
Lovely.
working?
Yeah, I think so.
Looks
I
good.
can see a lovely photo of a meadow. Yeah, so hi guys, I'm Lorna and thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I'll kickstart with talking a little bit about our glorious Cotswold Grasslands project, who we are, what we do, and we'll talk a little bit about management and restoration of grasslands as well. And then I will hand over partway to Anna. So if we could have the next slide, please. Yeah, I'm just going to talk about the program background as an introduction to who we are, and we'll talk about why should you make a meadow. Next slide, please. So we started as the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands back in 2019 on a 3-year project following on from the Save Our Magnificent Meadows project. And we worked for the Cotswold National Landscape, or the AONB as was. In 2022, off the back of the success of the projects that we'd had, we were made permanent by the Cotswold National Landscape, and we're now in our 6th year of operation. And we are funded through a combination of partnerships and grants and various projects. And we also sell some seed and some services on a not-for-profit basis. And our primary objective as the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands is to create and restore wildflower-rich grasslands all across the Cotswolds AONB and sort of immediate adjacent areas. And we do that by working with a wide variety of clients and partners. So over the years, we've worked with farmers and estates, small holdings, private homeowners and landowners, charitable organisations like the Wildlife Trust and the National Trust. We've worked with councils as well, in Cheltenham, Cirencester, community groups and villages, parish councils, schools, and even a solar farm. So a huge variety of people that we've worked with to undertake that restoration work. And you can see on the map there, you might just be able to make out some small yellow parcels. So those are some restoration areas. So that's the area of land that we've restored over the last 5 years. Obviously the red boundary being the area of the AONB. And if you added up the area of all of those little yellow restoration sites, that's 400 hectares of grassland that's been restored during that time period. Next slide, please. So what do we do as the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands? Well, as a programme, we can provide advice on the best management of grasslands and their suitability for restoration. So we do lots of site visits, going to have a look at grasslands, and we can kind of provide pointers and management advice, looking at what type of grassland they are and what might be the best way to bring it back into good condition. We can provide advice on funding available for grassland restoration and management, whether that be external funding and guidance on what might be suitable, but also through some of our own projects that can fund the restoration of grassland in the Cotswolds. We also undertake botanical surveys, including UK habitat assessment baselining and priority habitat inventory assessments, which are particularly relevant for an eligibility criteria for GS6, which Anna will go into a little bit later. We can also collect wildflower seed from donor wildflower meadows all across the Cotswolds, and that's really sort of the bread and butter of what we do in our programme. So that's really important for us because collecting wildflower seed locally helps us to preserve the local kind of native genetics of the Cotswold wildflowers. And this is important because when you purchase kind of commercially grown on wildflower seed, you don't always know where that's come from, what the provenance is, and sometimes those commercial wildflowers can look quite dissimilar to how the native wildflowers look, and this is because they're kind of grown on to be for growth and for vigor, so that they're often quite a lot bigger and different, which means that obviously they're somewhat different for the invertebrates and the insects that have adapted to match those native wildflowers. But also we feel that by keeping the wildflower seed local and collecting wildflower seed that's come from our native seed banks, we have a better chance of doing a successful restoration on local recipient sites. We also, as a team, create and restore grasslands. Obviously, using that seed, we can do bare soil sites or overseed existing grasslands. And we, through the winter then, we also undertake practical habitat management, such as scrub control, bramble, helping with sort of invasive clematis and different species, and generally kind of undertaking some practical work on sites as well. Next slide, please. But why should you do it? Well, it's really, really important. There's lots of different reasons. So we know that from the Lawton report, which was published back in 2010 and since before then, that for a healthy ecological network and for our nature recovery network, we need bigger wildlife sites, we need better quality wildlife sites, we need more of them, and we need them to be more joined up. Those were the findings of the report. And we know that locally in the Cotswolds in the 1930s, 40% of the AOMB was covered in species-rich wildflower grassland. And this habitat can support a vast array of wildlife, obviously not just the rare wildflowers themselves, but supporting invertebrates and then birds and mammals and all sorts of creatures that depend on those wildflower habitats. But because of agricultural intensification and changing land management practices, but also changing land use and other pressures, we've seen massive loss of this habitat type, and we've now got less than 1.5% remaining. So it really is a habitat that, you know, was really widespread and is now significantly decreased. And for sustaining our pollinators, which are obviously important for pollinating our crops and helping us to have food and other products, we need to support them by providing the habitats that they need. So they need that array of wildflowers to support them. We also know that there are public health and well-being benefits from species-rich grasslands, and that time spent outdoors in nature is good for our physical and mental health. But also, you know, wildflowers have a cultural and sort of historical significance in the Cotswolds and wider. So they are just lovely places to be. As a habitat type, they have low management costs. So they're a great thing to include for diversification on the farm. They have basically zero input costs because they don't really require anything. And in terms of management, they're managed using a single hay cut or some grazing. They also have health benefits for livestock. So historically, many wildflower grasslands, especially the species-rich limestone grasslands that we see in the Cotswolds, were referred to as medicine fields. And this is because the farmers and land managers would move their animals into those fields if they were showing any symptoms of being unwell. And the medicinal properties found in many of the wildflowers that we have in these grasslands would bring them back into better health. So we found through studies that some of the species can do things like reduce the parasitic burdens, they can increase the mineral intakes for stock, and they can aid in digestion as well. And then grasslands are also a really good carbon store. So they have the advantage that 90% of their carbon is stored below ground. And this also means that they're a more stable carbon store than woodland, for example, where they're slightly more susceptible to things like wildfires or pests and disease. So we have massive carbon storage benefits. And similarly, they're useful for when it comes to flood management and in terms of their ability to help us with flood alleviation and buffering. And lastly, you can get an income from having a wildflower grassland as well. So there are schemes that exist just to pay farmers and land managers to manage or create these habitats. And quite often this is income on a piece of land that may not otherwise be bringing in an income, because wildflower grasslands quite regularly do well on difficult terrain or areas of land that have generally low productivity. And you can also get some sort of products from wildflower grasslands in the form of seed, or if you've got a slightly more rich grassland, then you may be able to take a hay cut as well. Next slide, please. So this is really just to show some of the incredible diversity that we find in our wildflower grasslands. And you'll see there a huge array of different colours and shapes, and all of these wildflowers obviously have developed with a particular niche in our ecosystems and provide food and habitat for all sorts of different insects and invertebrates and many different other wildlife. And over the last 5 years, across all the wildflower grasslands that we've been working on, we've recorded 371 different species of wildflowers. So there can be a vast array of life in these grasslands. We've got some lovely examples on here. So we've got that big purple sort of bell-shaped flower in the corner there. That's pasque flower, which is a species in the buttercup family that blooms in April and May. And it's now particularly rare in the UK and restricted to just a few chalk and limestone grasslands. But we're lucky enough to see that in the Cotswolds on some of our limestone grasslands. We've got sainfoin down the bottom, which is a perennial legume that also likes limey soils. And it's really, really attractive to insects. It's good for our pollinators, but it's also a natural wormer for livestock. It's really good because it's a legume that doesn't cause bloat, and it helps with absorption and digestion of protein in livestock as well. We've also got quaking grass, just to give one more example, that little fine sort of rattly looking grass there, which is an excellent food source for farmland birds, with birds such as yellowhammers and linnets and greenfinches enjoying eating those seeds. So they all have a part to play. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to move on now to talking about general kind of advice for management that we give and how we undertake our restoration process in the Glorious Cotswold Grasslands team. So typical management, we would suggest that to allow the wildflower meadow to be able to set seed and for the flowers to bloom, we need to shut the grassland off from April till about mid-July. Then we take a hay cut in mid-July or August. The later the hay cut, potentially in the summer, the better, because it will benefit the invertebrates if it can be a later cut. But obviously understanding that if you're planning to do something with that hay, then it may need to be an earlier cut, and obviously the weather can be a massive impact on that as well. But what really is critical is that it has to be a cut where the cuttings are removed. So if it's not cut for hay and it's cut to waste, it does have to, those cuttings will have to be removed, because what we're looking for is grasslands with low fertility. So it's important to remove those nutrients off the grassland. This also can be optional if you have livestock that can graze the standing hay. So you wouldn't necessarily have to cut it if you had livestock that could do that, but that would depend on what livestock you had and how vigorous the growth in the grassland was. And then typically we would suggest aftermath grazing, following on from the hay cut through the autumn and winter until the land gets too wet. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in managing some of your land for wildflowers, you'd want to identify what's going to be your best site for restoration on your farm. And this would involve leaving those less suitable sites for your summer grazing, because obviously we've just mentioned there that you're going to need to shut the the wildflower grassland off to stock through the sort of flowering period. But obviously, if you've got livestock, you need somewhere else to put them. So it's really important to include that run back land or that layback land in the plan. And this photo shows a really good example of a restoration site with some of the features that we would be looking for to undertake some restoration there. So we've got an open and sunny site. A south-facing aspect is best for this because those wildflowers need warm soil conditions to support the microbiota. Also, a free draining site. So obviously, it makes sense that our limestone grasslands would be good for this, where they drain away freely. And what we're looking for is that low fertility soil, so that poor soil. And if you're not sure about what type of soil you have, what we sometimes use as a sort of indication of that is whether you've got some diversity in there or not. So we'd be looking for meadow grasses and perhaps a few different species in your grassland, rather than where you might have a monoculture or just a ryegrass field that's taken over by competitive species that do well on highly fertile ground. Ideally, if you've got access to grazing, that's going to be beneficial for the longer term management of the grassland, but also, access to machinery or contractors and willingness to undertake that management is really important. And being close to existing wildflower grasslands is of benefit because obviously we talked about the need to try and connect up our habitats. So that's always a bonus. And there are a number of tools that we can use to look at the suitability of sites for restoration. So obviously looking at that connectivity, we can look at the Nature Recovery Network map and look at opportunities that exist to link up already important grassland sites. But we can also look at geology maps to look at the underlying geology and what the soil conditions might be like. And we can undertake botanical surveys there to look for indicator species, and those are the ones that let us know what sort of potential habitat we might be able to create on that site, by looking for species that are typical of particular types of grasslands. So if we perhaps change the management or we introduce a bit of seed, we might be able to bring it into that type of grassland because we've seen those indicator species. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to then run through an overview of our restoration process and sort of take it month by month what we actually do to bring a grassland into restoration. So we start off in May and June by undertaking a botanical survey. So if we've come and had a look at a site and we've decided that it's got those features we were just looking at and it's got some good potential for restoration, then we'd want to know exactly what was in there to start us off as our baseline. And this is important because it's helpful if we know what's already in the field, but also it gives us a baseline to go back to, so that in the future when we come to monitor and to keep tabs on how the grassland is changing and developing, we know where we've come from. So undertaking those botanical surveys is important, and it also really helps us to identify a closely matched donor seed source. So what we do is to match seed from donor sites to recipient sites, looking at a variety of factors, including geography. So obviously we try and keep the distance between the donor and the recipient site as small as possible so that we're keeping that seed nice and local. But also looking at the soil type, the vegetation type, and how damp the grassland is, and so on. And then in July and August, we have a brush seed harvester that we take out to a variety of local donor meadows, and we collect wildflower seed for that restoration. So this works. So we've got a Honda petrol engine on a rotating brush, and as we drive over the grassland, it sweeps through the vegetation and it flicks the seed back into a hopper. And then we can drive the hopper over a tarp laid out in the field, empty the seed out, and then with the help of volunteers, we sieve the seed to remove the stalks and the chaff. And then we spread it out and we turn it throughout the day, so it's laid out in the sunshine and it starts that process of drying off. And then we can take it back to a barn and we continue to spread it and turn it and dry it over the following days and weeks. And then we sort the seed and bag it up. And on each of our donor sites, we've undertaken a botanical survey, so we know what's growing in that grassland and we know what seed to expect within that mix, and then we can match it up to a particular restoration site. And then in September and October, we prepare the ground by cutting the grass really short and removing those cuttings, and using a tine or disc harrow to create 20 to 30% bare earth at surface level. And then we spread the seed. So we need to just create a kind of seed to soil contact, and the seed has to be broadcast by hand because it's a mix of many different shapes and sizes, because it's lots of different species in there. And that's because we don't clean the seed in the same way that other seed is sometimes cleaned. So it does still contain those small components of kind of casings, etc. But these can be quite helpful for drying the seed, and also for sort of uneven distribution of the seed. And if it's not a bare soil site and we're overseeding into an existing grassland, then we sow the seed in the autumn. And this is because a large component of that seed mix is containing yellow rattle. And yellow rattle is also known as the meadow maker, and it's an important part of our seed mixes because it's a parasite on grasses. So it works really well for our project because it attaches onto the roots of grass and leaches water and nutrients out of the grass, which helps to reduce its growth and creates opportunities for wildflowers to become established and to compete. But yellow rattle does require something called vernalization, which is a sort of series of cold snaps and frosts, and it kickstarts its growth. So it has to be on the ground over the winter to break its dormancy and get it growing in the spring. So then in October, once we've broadcast our seed, ideally we'd have animals come in to graze and to tread in the seed, and to keep the grass nice and short so that it doesn't overshade those little seedlings. And then from April, we'd go into that process of excluding the livestock from the field, allowing those wildflowers to flower and set seed. And then we fall back into that management then of taking that annual hay cut or grazing through the winter, and so on. So I will finish there, and I think the next thing is going to be Anna talking about funding options.
There we go. Right. Yeah. In the second half of this presentation, as Lorna said, I'm going to talk about the various funding options available for grassland management and restoration. And as I'm sure you're mostly aware, you know, the funding for environmental actions is currently in a real state of flux, and we don't necessarily have all the detail of how some of these options are going to work, but hopefully we're still going to be able to give you a useful overview. I'm going to start with a few Cotswold centric funding options because that's where our project's based, but as I know some of you are from outside the Cotswolds area, we're going to look at some of the nationally available funding sources. So the first two funding sources are fairly similar partnerships that we've got with water companies. So first, our partnership with Severn Trent Water. So it can fund restoration on land holdings in the Severn Trent water area, which overlaps with the northwest part of the Cotswolds. It's a 4-year project, and this is the final year of it, as far as we know. And it funds 100% of all the upfront costs of restoration. So advisory visits, botanical surveys, the cost of the seed itself, any seed spreading costs, and also a contribution towards ground preparation. We will also come and do botanical resurveys every 3 to 5 years to see how the restoration is progressing, and we're obviously happy to carry on providing ongoing management advice as needed. It's the Severn Trent project is coordinated entirely by us at CNL, so minimal paperwork for people using this funding, which is often a really positive thing, I think. And the expectation is that The restored areas will be managed as wildflower meadows into the future, but there is no written management agreement that you have to sign up to. It's just worth noting that this partnership it funds the upfront costs, and there's no ongoing management payments under this. So, going forward, you might be looking to get into stewardship or something to fund the ongoing management. So the Thames water funding that we've got is very similar in terms of commitments and benefits as the Severn Trent funding. The two main differences are obviously the area covered. So our Thames water funding covers the even load catchment, which covers a little bit of Gloucestershire to the east of Moreton and Stowe, and then much of the kind of northern half of West Oxfordshire, including Chipping Norton, Charlbury, Woodstock, that kind of area. And the second difference is the requirement that landowners just need to match fund the costs of the restoration process itself. So just the costs of ground preparation and seed, essentially. But this can be contributed in kind. So, for example, if landowners prepare the ground themselves, this can count as match funding. Yeah, otherwise just very, very similar to the Severn Trent funding. So the third partnership that we have is with National Highways. This funding partnership, it's also in the Cotswolds, but it now covers the whole of the Cotswold National Landscape area, which is really quite a big area, all the way kind of from Banbury up in the north down to Bath in the south. It's a 3-year project, and we're currently in year 2 of 3, and it's a really, really generous funding source. So it covers 100% of all the upfront costs, including advisory visits, surveys, ground preparation, the seed itself, and seed spreading. But the difference here is that it also provides annual management payments to landowners to cover things like hay cuts and grazing costs. And these start at £311 per hectare and rise to £427 per hectare at year 30. So it's basically a 1% increment year on year. The funding also covers regular botanical resurveys every 3 to 5 years, or any ongoing management advice. Plus, there is a contingency fund for any future interventions needed. So, for example, if we decide that the sward is missing some kind of typical species, we can introduce more seed if required, that kind of thing. So the whole process is coordinated by CNL, and there is a written agreement. The written agreement is with us rather than National Highways, but it does require a long-term commitment of the landowners for a period of 30 years. The rationale being that it takes as long as 30 years for a calcareous wildflower grassland to be considered as fully established, and this follows the time frame adopted by the statutory BNG funding. And it's just worth noting as well that the written agreement will create a covenant on the land. And in terms of where this funding offers the best value against the other funding options available, we think it's best really for existing grasslands that are in need of restoration of around the 1 to 7 hectare mark. More than 7 hectares and potentially countryside stewardship or the statutory BNG funding may well be more suitable, or at least, worth looking at as well. So this funding source is called Farming in Protected Landscapes, or FIPL, and this is a grant scheme rolled out as part of DEFRA's agricultural transition plan. It's administered by each of the national landscapes and national parks. So our FIPL scheme covers land holdings anywhere in the Cotswold National Landscape, but there are equivalent projects in other national landscapes and national parks. And it funds projects that supports nature recovery, mitigates against climate change, helps people to enjoy or learn about the landscape, or helps protect the landscape itself. It's a 4-year project and it runs till March 2025. So if you're thinking about using this as a funding source, it's a good idea to kind of start speaking to the team now. And the projects we've been involved in that have been funded by FIPL generally funds 100% of all the upfront costs, including, you know, same sort of thing, advisory visits, surveys, ground prep and seed. But it's just worth noting that where there is an equivalent stewardship optional rate, FIPL is capped at that amount, and it doesn't fund any ongoing management cost. Again, the idea being is that if once you've got your restoration up and running, you would then look to stewardship to support the ongoing management of the site. So where this is a really, really good funding source is projects that either fall outside the eligibility areas for our other funded projects, or projects where grassland restoration is just part of a bigger project which requires funding for other aspects such as either fencing or grazing infrastructure, because FIPL can cover all these things as well. So ELMS, or the new environmental land management scheme, it's part of DEFRA's plan to phase out subsidies and pay farmers for environmental goods alongside productive farming. And it consists of 3 tiers or 3 levels. So tier 1 is the sustainable farming incentive, or SFI, and tier 2 is a revamped version of the existing countryside stewardship scheme, and tier 3 is known as landscape recovery. So good news here that DEFRA has recently announced an increase in payment rates by an average of 10% for various SFI and CS options, but noting that these include some really very generous increases to species-rich grassland options, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. It's also introduced 50 new actions, including a number of premium actions, which include one for restoration of floodplain meadows. So I'll just talk a little bit about SFI first of all. SFI is the basic ELM scheme, and it's going to pay farmers to kind of adopt and maintain sustainable farming practices that can protect and enhance the natural environment alongside food production. And it contains a couple of options which can be used for grassland creation and restoration. On permanent grasslands, there's LIG1, which supports basic grassland management, really suitable for grassland that is not sufficiently species rich to access the higher payment rates under CS, potentially could cover grasslands that are in the process of being restored. And then on arable land, IPM2 can be used to seed blocks of land with a grass and wildflower mix, and our local brush harvested seed has been approved for use in this option, as well as the kind of more commonly used commercial mixes. But it's just worth noting here that there's a slightly higher payment rate available through the CS option AB8, which is very, very similar. So moving on to countryside stewardship. So CS is the mid-level ELM scheme, and it's probably the most appropriate for supporting grassland restoration, particularly given these recent large increase in payment rates for the grassland options. They now pay about 4 times what they did in 2023. So there are 2 entry levels to CS. There's the mid-tier, which is kind of appropriate for most farms and most agreements, and then a competitive higher tier, which is for sites that require complex management. Oh, sorry. So the relevant grassland options in CS, GS6, management of species-rich grassland, and GS7 and 8, which are restoration and creation of species-rich grassland. And so previously, only GS6 has been available in the mid-tier. However, DEFRA have hinted that the new grassland management option that's going to be released in the summer will effectively combine GS6 and 7 and 8 into one option that's going to be available to both mid and higher tier, which would be really fantastic news for grassland restoration, because you know, so many more farmers and landowners would be able to access the restoration options. But we need to wait for the detail to be released later in the year to know for sure. The other CS option which we've used is AB8, and we've used that now on a number of arable reversion projects. And again, our project, the local brush harvested seed that we collect as part of our project has been approved for use in this option, as well as the commercial mixers. So landscape recovery is the top level ELM scheme. And it's basically, the idea is that neighbouring landowners and farmers work together to kind of co-design a bespoke agreement to benefit the environment through landscape scale projects, much bigger projects, and could definitely include projects relating to large scale kind of grassland or floodplain restoration. And as an organisation, CNL are currently in discussions with DEFRA to improve the chances of future grassland proposals. These are long-term agreements, 20-year plus, and the application process is a bit different to SFI and CS, so it's a competitive process. We've had 2 rounds to date, and a further round is expected in 2024. And it's quite possible that you know, that a group of farmers in our area will look to submit one in relation to grassland restoration. So we're nearly there. I think it's good news, isn't it, that there's so many funding sources available, even if it does make things a little bit complicated. So biodiversity net gain. So from February 24, i.e. now, so it's just become law that developers must deliver at least 10% biodiversity net gain or BNG on most developments. And they can do this either on site, on the development site, or if there isn't sufficient room, etc., there they can do it off site on kind of local land, or as a very last resort, they're able to just purchase statutory credits from the government. But we expect that most statutory BNG will be delivered off site. And landowners and farmers can help deliver this off-site BNG by creating or enhancing habitats on their land. You know, a couple of examples of this could be arable reversions to species-rich grassland, or enhancement of improved grassland to species-rich grassland. And then the idea being that the habitat enhancement will generate biodiversity units, and this is calculated using a metric. And then these units can then be sold to developers to meet their obligations. It's again long-term projects, and they will, anyone wanting to participate in BNG will have to sign a 30-year legal agreement with either a responsible body or a local authority. And in terms of responsible bodies in Gloucestershire, we've got the Gloucestershire Nature and Climate Fund, or GNCF. In Oxfordshire, there's the Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment, or TOE, and other counties will have local BNG brokers, plus there are national organisations such as the Environment Bank doing a similar thing. So because of the kind of complexity in project management, etc., it tends to be more suited for larger sites. For example, I know GNCF have got a 7-hectare minimum, and I think TOE have got a 10-hectare minimum for the amount of land that has to be entered into the BNG agreement. And sites, obviously the agreements will create land covenants, and sites must be registered on a public register. So the kind of finances being bandied around for BNG are really very lucrative, and they are really likely to provide a good level of funding to landowners. But I think you've got to bear in mind that there are also a lot of costs to consider. For example, things like broker fees, project management costs, legal costs, obviously all the upfront costs of restoration, and ongoing management and monitoring. So it does remain to be seen, how well the BNG numbers are going to stack up against the new CS rates, etc. Yeah, and if the thought of all this kind of form filling and management agreements is just too much, there's always the option to self-finance grassland restoration projects, and we usually get a handful of landowners every year who prefer this route. So it's possible to buy local brush harvested seed commercially, and I've included details of a couple up here. So Emmersgate and Cotswold Seeds, both really reputable suppliers. And for those of you local to the Cotswolds, we're able to sell seed that we collect using our brush seed harvester at £50 per kilogram, and our rates do tend to be lower than the commercial organisations, just because we're a not-for-profit organisation. And I think that's me. So yeah, no, as I say, hopefully that was helpful. Lots of different funding sources available, and if anyone wants sort of more tailored advice as to what's the most suitable one for their kind of area or project, we're really happy to talk to people.
Great, thanks so much, Lorna and Anna. I'm going to give you a virtual round of applause. That was so interesting and really informative. Thank you so much. It was nice to hear all about the why as well as the how. So thank you very much. I noticed also that you've got a programme assistant vacancy on there. Is that a job advert that you've got out?
Yeah, it is, but it closed yesterday. So
you find someone good to join the team.
Well, yeah, we haven't got to the interview point yesterday, but we've had lots of applications. So yeah, hopefully, a really nice opportunity for somebody to come and join us hanging out in meadows.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind taking your slides down now, and then I'm going to open questions out to everyone who's here. And if you are happy to, please just raise a hand, and then I'll shout out your name to ask your question. Christian, I noticed that you've put one in the chat. Do you want to pose that directly to Anna and Lorna?
Hello, yes. I should probably reveal that part of my land management advice work, rather than farming work, is in the high weald area of Outsnet, or national landscape, as it were, where it's not chalk and limestone grasslands, although I grew up with those, but we have lots of neglected pastures that have become less species rich, and so this whole area is a big interest. And my question was really, when the SAM3 herbal lays option came out for SFI last year, our equivalent to the Cotswold Seeds group, which is actually outsourced to Agrifactors, had a lot of inquiries of people chasing SAM3 on sites that really shouldn't have gone that way, because they thought it would be an easy option to put in, and they were doing that in the absence of any surveys of where their grassland could potentially progress. And now they're in those arrangements because they signed up last autumn. So it's a question of whether you saw that. I did also see a site in the Cotswolds last October that where people were really keen to pursue SAM3, and they had the right species on the land, but also they could have done much better in terms of, it was a traditional Cotswold limestone grassland, and they could have done better with it. Any comments? Any instances?
You've actually got a better name for this job than I have. I thought mine was quite good.
Yeah. So sorry. Well, coming into this work with this surname, I had to learn something about it because I couldn't get away.
I think one of the reasons that the CS rates for management of species-rich grassland have been increased to £646 per hectare is to bring it on a par with the payment for herbal lays, to remove that incentive to farmers to plough up for herbal lays. So I think that's one of the big reasons it's been taken up to that level. So I think herbal lays are great, and they're better than nothing, but they aren't a patch on a well-managed species-rich grassland. And now hopefully kind of the fact that the payment for management matches it, and actually just managing what you've got is actually a lot easier than ploughing it up, and all the costs of reseeding a herbal ley will hopefully disincentivize farmers from doing that going forward. But I know a few sites in fact, I was just chatting to an estate owner yesterday who basically was saying he regretted putting herbal leys in 3 or 4 fields because he'd much rather have left it as what was kind of becoming relatively species rich grassland. But yeah, no, it's come a little bit late, hasn't it, I think, but hopefully going forward it's going to put everyone in a bit of a better position.
Thanks, Christine. Good question. Any other questions? Anything you'd like to hear? Victoria or Vicky, go ahead.
Oh, hi. We've put kind of half the farm into the herbal leys. They were arable fields, and I suppose it was to get further nutrients into those fields to make them more productive. How easy is it to convert them back to a species-rich meadow?
Yeah, there's not an easy answer to this. It's something we've discussed internally with the Wildlife Trust about developing a kind of best practice about processes around doing this, because, you know, technically it's still arable land, you know, so, you know, there's discussions about, you know, you could potentially glyphosate the lot and start with a stale seabed and start again. But, you know, I know the Wildlife Trust and us have got kind of real reluctance to do that. So I think the short answer is we're looking at kind of forming a best practice of how to do that. But in the meantime, I know I've had a look at your farm before, haven't I? We met a few years ago.
Yeah.
But at the moment, it's looking at sites on a site-by-site basis and looking at the state of the herbal ley, how lush the growth is, if it's turned into a kind of, if it's naturally going towards species-rich grassland already. So I think, you know, for now, it's site visits, looking at the individual fields and kind of making plans based on that. But, you know, something we're actively thinking about, because I think we're going to get more and more inquiries about doing that now.
Yeah, I think we're all kind of stuck in it for 5 years, aren't we? So it will be that point when people start to make some decisions.
Yeah.
But I know some of ours are on quite a steep bank, so potentially they and you know, the soil isn't great, it's mostly stone. So I imagine those are going to be the ones that are going to be more favourable then, and into more of a meadow instead of flower.
Absolutely. You know, you've got a lovely site where you are, you know, right by Ravensgate Common, aren't you? And you know, you're right by really nice species rich grassland, and like you say, you've got steep stony banks, so they're brilliant for restoration. It's just I mean, you know, when you get near the end of the 5 years, we should just come and have another look and make a specific plan, I think.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Vicky. Great question. Any other questions from Tony, Roland, or Ellie, or Beatrice? I think I might ask a question, if that's okay then. It sort of follows on from Vicky's question, which is, I know that, I guess, as with herbal leys, if you've got a sort of ryegrass monoculture, that's obviously not one of your preferred sites for conversion. Do you have any advice for people who own that sort of grassland but are desperate to self-fund a bit of wildflower restoration?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for sites that look very, very fertile, we have kind of recommended soil testing just to check exactly where you are on that. But the kind of recommended management really is to take several hay cuts off a year for a couple of years to just try and get that fertility down a little bit before you kind of start incurring big costs putting seed down. But yeah, no, I mean, it can be difficult, but, you know, if you're willing to put the work in, taking the hay cuts off to reduce the fertility, and then, you know, get the yellow rattle in to try and weaken the grasses more. I think that's probably the best approach. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Lorna.
No, just to add that I think if you go down that line of the 2-cut silage system to try and strip the nutrients out, that sort of repeat soil testing, looking particularly at the phosphate levels, will help give an indication of what the fertility actually is, until you reach a number on that index that's suitable then. And that you could try introducing a suite of wildflowers that might be slightly more able to compete on a more fertile site that might have more grasses in it. But otherwise there are some quite extreme measures that can be taken, like topsoil stripping and things, but those are quite drastic. So yeah, it's about that soil testing and yeah, nutrient stripping, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know this isn't part of our project, but I think sometimes if you've got a really fertile field, as well as the kind of nutrient stripping, etc., it may sometimes be more suitable to buy a commercial wildflower mix to plant in that field, because I think they tend to be grown for vigor and growth, and they're more likely to be able to compete with grasses than perhaps seed that we've collected off the really kind of infertile, brushy Cotswold soils. That's probably the only time I'll recommend you go and buy commercial seed. But yeah, no, we want things to be successful. There's no point in putting our seed down on a site where it's just going to get swamped by ryegrass.
And by those commercial companies, do you mean, is it Emmersgate and Cotswold Seed? So that's who you mean to go to?
So I mean, Emmersgate and Cotswold Seeds are the two locally to us that are really reputable. They're really, really knowledgeable, and they've got plenty of seed mixes suited to different soil types, etc. And we know they're all grown locally.
Great, thank you very much. Any last questions from anyone? Great, well, Lorna and Anna, thank you so much for, again, such an informative discussion. I'm going to stop the recording now.